Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the DEA New York Division Special Agent in Charge, Frank Tarentino, who's with me here today, Nassau County Police Assistant Chief William Leahy, who's with me here today, and the investigators and prosecutors from my office who worked on this case. Today we are here to announce the arrest of a 21-year-old Kissimmee, Florida man, Devin Anthony Megarian. We allege that he is the leader of an elaborate multi-state conspiracy that has fraudulently compromised the e-prescribing credentials of doctors throughout the United States, and then used those credentials to issue tens of thousands of prescriptions for narcotics across our country. This investigation is very much ongoing, but by one estimate, the defendant was grossing between $75,000 and $250,000 a month from this scheme. He was arrested after a nearly year-long investigation that was conducted by my office, the Nassau County Police Department, the DEA, and the New York State Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement. He is charged with criminal sale of a controlled substance in the first degree, which is an A felony, and 18 other related charges. The defendant was arraigned on Wednesday, January 17th, and he was remanded. He was back in court today. The remand status was continued, and as I said, this investigation is active and ongoing. In the past, it was common for a criminal to steal a doctor's prescription pad and use it to fill illegal prescriptions. Well, this defendant and his associates allegedly took that template and updated it for 2024 in a grand way. This is one of the most complex and technologically sophisticated drug operations I have ever witnessed. The scope of it is absolutely shocking. We learned that the defendant and his associates are part of a wide-ranging conspiracy in which they surreptitiously commandeer the e-prescribing credentials of a doctor from around the country. They use those compromised accounts to issue and fill tens of thousands of prescriptions for narcotics and other controlled substance in Nassau County and nationwide. The investigation started with a relatively routine arrest. In February of 2023, a 22-year-old man was arrested outside a pharmacy in Great Neck. That defendant, who I am not naming today, allegedly picked up 2 prescriptions, including one for promethazine codeine. The prescription was issued for a man born in 1969 who was obviously not the 22-year-old defendant who was arrested. The drug, which is a Schedule II controlled substance, is a cough syrup. It is commonly abused and mixed with other drugs and sold on the streets. In investigations like this, we usually look first to see if there's possibly a dirty doctor or a rogue pharmacist involved. But in fact, in this case, both the doctor and the pharmacy acted ethically and actually assisted us in the continued investigation. The pharmacist was extremely helpful. He called law enforcement and alerted them to this possible unusual prescription he had received. From an investigative standpoint, nothing at that point was making sense. How could the defendant get a prescription with E-Prescribing in this name to this pharmacy? We subsequently learned that the doctor who purportedly issued the prescription was a Florida-based physician, and he reported unusual activity related to his cell phone and his prescribing license to the DEA. In fact, he had even set up a voicemail on his cell phone to verify, warning pharmacies that his e-prescribing prescriptions had been compromised, and if they were getting prescriptions in his name, they should not fill them. So we had to figure out, how could someone get into a doctor's e-prescribing credentials? And we soon learned that this one incident in February of 2023 was not a single event. There were doctors around the country being compromised, and they were compromised in a remarkably stealthily fashion. Because by the time the doctors, the various state-based prescribing monitoring programs, the companies that facilitate electronic prescribing, and the pharmacies that dispense these controlled substances would become aware of what was happening, tens of thousands of prescriptions would have already been fraudulently issued in the doctor's name. And by the time the prescriptions could be flagged or pulled, hundreds of prescriptions for controlled substance like promethazine, codeine, and narcotics like oxycodone had already been filled in Nassau County, throughout New York State, and around the country. Some person or some group was finding a way to circumvent the numerous protections put in place. We learned that the defendant arrested in Great Neck was a foot soldier for a much larger operation. And believe it or not, this is where the investigation gets even more complicated. We learned that Devin Anthony Megarian was compromising the cell phones of doctors around the country. We all carry them, they're all on our hips. He was able to somehow compromise the cell phone and get in and get the e-prescribing credentials of the doctor. He would then create fraudulent e-prescribing accounts using the doctor's legitimate credentials. And he would obtain and manipulate those legitimate credentials. How he was able to do this, we are still investigating. Approximately every 4 weeks, there was another doctor who would be compromised. He operated a channel on the Telegram mobile app. This app is actually favored by narcotics traffickers and other criminals because it is notoriously difficult to work with when you are in law enforcement. The Telegram channel essentially acted as an advertisement board for this defendant. He would let his customers know when the next prescription rounds were coming. He would call them a portal. Tell them that the portal was going to open so they could place their orders. We later learned that the defendant's customers would message him directly through Telegram to purchase from the defendant either the actual prescription, or, which they would then be responsible to fill, or the controlled substance like oxycodone, which someone else would fill and they would buy from him. After everything was lined up with these customers, Megarian would know what he needed. He would compromise the doctor's credentials and manipulate the e-prescribing account that he had created, leading to the issuance of thousands of e-scripts. He would do it, usually his preferred method was late on a weekend. So for instance, at 1 a.m. on a Saturday morning, Megarian used a cloned doctor's phone, would seek to create the new e-prescribing accounts using one of the many smartphone applications that doctors regularly and legitimately use to issue electronic prescriptions. In many cases, a text message was sent back to the doctor's phone, alerting them that something was happening, something was changing on their phone or their e-prescribing. But simultaneously, as the new e-prescribing account was created, 300 to 400 text messages would be sent to the doctor's phone. In doing so, the doctor may not notice, through going through these 400 text messages, that he even had a notice or an alert that there was changes being made to his phone and his accounts. At this point, the doctor would be compromised. And what happens next is truly astonishing. Using technology, what we call bots, between approximately 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., thousands of prescriptions were issued from the compromised doctor. In one weekend, 18,500 scripts were issued in a 5-hour period. Let that sink in for a minute. 18,500 prescriptions, 1 weekend, 5-hour period. We know that these prescriptions were sent to 18 different states. Using technology, again, these prescriptions were sent out to approximate geographical areas of Megarian's customers, who would purchase the prescriptions from Megarian directly, or his associates who would fill the prescriptions at Megarian's directions. Those associates who would go from pharmacy to pharmacy were referred to as the runners. For instance, if a customer of Megarian's lived near Eisenhower Park, essentially the center of Nassau County, that person would request multiple scripts. The scripts would be sent to pharmacies from Jamaica to Farmingdale. The bots are what created the fake names, date of birth, and addresses for these scripts. And many of the addresses appeared legitimate to further confuse the pharmacy. The runners would then fan out to the various pharmacies and pick up the prescriptions. Sometimes a pharmacy would turn a customer away because something about the prescription seemed off, but in most instances they were and appeared to be legitimate prescriptions from a legitimate doctor's e-prescribing account. The runners would spend the next 2 or 3 days picking up prescriptions from around the geographical area, and we saw that these prescriptions were sent to mom and pop pharmacies and chain drug pharmacies, such as Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, and others. We learned that in order to extend his reach, the defendant employed runners in states including New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and the Carolinas. The runners would work at the defendant's discretion and direction. They would fill these prescriptions based upon information the defendant provided them, and they would usually be compensated in the form of a portion of the controlled substance that they were going to pick up by filling these fraudulent prescriptions. Thousands of dollars via payment apps and cryptocurrency were flowing back to Megarian. And sadly, it would take the doctors, the electronic medical record companies, the e-prescribing platforms, and the pharmacies days to realize what was happening. And by then, as the old saying goes, the horse was already out of the barn, and the scripts were filled. Megarian and his runners commanded a premiere for their product. As many of you know, my office, the NCPD, the DEA are constantly warning the public about the dangers of fentanyl. We see drug dealers selling counterfeit oxycodone that is really, in fact, fentanyl. People are dying across the country because they're taking these fake oxycodone pills, which are sometimes called pressies. But Megarian's crew had real prescription oxycodone filled by CVS so they could demand a higher price for their product. For instance, a 30 milligram of real oxycodone is worth $30 or more, and the end user could be assured they weren't taking fentanyl. This defendant and his associates lived extravagant lifestyles. Their favorite haunts were steakhouses and strip clubs. They took flights around the country. They rented exotic rental cars and bought courtside seats at NBA playoff games. And all this is possible when you're able to sell promethazine codeine for $2,000 a pint and oxycodone at up to $2,200 a bottle. $2,200 a bottle. The defendant was on our radar for a number of months. We learned that at least several runners were working for him in this county alone. We have extensive records of the defendant's communications, social media activity, movements. We know that he had so much business that oftentimes he had to turn customers and runners away. We have surveillance and pharmacy records which detail a trip to New York in July, in which he and his associates were filling prescriptions throughout New York City and throughout Long Island. The defendant was arrested last week in New York City by members of the Nassau County Law Enforcement. He was in the area to pick up $14,000 from a single individual who was picking up prescriptions for oxycodone at the defendant's direction. The $14,000 was compensation for a total of 7 prescriptions for oxycodone, 30 milligrams each, which contained 90 tablets for a total of 630 pills. That total is important because based on that weight, the defendant was charged with the top count of criminal sale of a controlled substance in the first degree and A1 narcotics felony, which carries a minimum sentence of 8 years in prison. And based on the weight, that charge is also one of the few drug bail qualifying offenses after the criminal justice reforms of 2019. And as I've said, this investigation is very much ongoing. For many years, we were lulled into a false sense of security with the advent of e-prescribing. And to be fair, it's a much better system than the old pen and paper. But this defendant and his associates have found ways to exploit the entire security system around e-prescribing. We are examining phones, phone companies, electronic medical records, e-prescribing applications, and pharmacies. There are, unfortunately, vulnerabilities up and down the security chain, and this group has been exploiting them. The schemes are evolving, and I am here today to warn parents, doctors, pharmacists, medical practices, software engineers about these major security vulnerabilities. Where we used to tell a pharmacist, if it's an e-prescription, you don't have to look twice at it, now, unfortunately, you do. The opioid crisis is ever evolving, and these drugs are flooding our neighborhood. This case is a sobering reminder that drug dealers have become cyber criminals who are often way ahead of everyone else. We must remain vigilant. We must invest in creating the firewalls to stop this activity and do better at detecting and stopping them. Investigations like this are not possible without great partners. We thank the New York State Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement for their extraordinary work. I thank the Orange County, Florida Sheriff's Office for their cooperation in this investigation. I thank the DEA Orlando District Office for their cooperation. And of course, our partners at the DEA here in New York and the Nassau County Police Department. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank Tarentino of the DEA.
Thank you, Ann. So good morning. Thank you for being here. As the District Attorney mentioned, my name is Frank Tarentino. I'm the Special Agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration, New York Division. Thank you for being here today on this important news conference. I would just say what I've said many times before. DEA's mission is to save lives. And our work has never been more difficult, yet more important than it is today. The leading cause of death among Americans between the ages of 18 and 45 is drug poisoning. In drug law enforcement today, we face an ever-increasing public health, public safety, and national security threat. And two of those significant threats are: one, synthetic man-made opioids, both legitimate and illegitimate, and two, encrypted applications and social media platforms that the 21st century drug trafficker has weaponized to push their poison to the most vulnerable. This investigation, this complex, multi-jurisdictional investigation, discovered both of these threats. Powerful synthetic opioids like fentanyl or diverted prescription opioid medication like oxycodone have become silent and efficient killers, flooding into our illicit drug supply, creating an addiction and a dependence like we have never seen before in our history. 80% of the drug-related deaths in the United States are caused by opioids. And the drug trafficking organizations and drug traffickers are deliberately and treacherously taking advantage of the most vulnerable and the substance use dependent people by driving addiction through innovative and strategic marketing with M30s or Pressies, as the DA mentioned, which are fake pills made from fentanyl and methamphetamine, but also from diverted prescription opioid medication. Let's be clear. Diverted prescription opioid medication is just as dangerous as any other illicit drug on our street today. Let's be clear, just as dangerous. This is something that every one of us has to be mindful of. The truth is that the only safe prescription medication is from a trusted, legitimate doctor for a legitimate reason and dispensed by a legitimate pharmacy. This investigation discovered nothing here was legitimate. The DEA Long Island District Office, the Nassau County Police Department, the New York Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, and the Nassau County Prosecutor's Office uncovered a complex criminal conspiracy operating up and down the East Coast, driven and orchestrated by Devin Anthony McGarian, the ringleader who created an elaborate scheme using things such as cloning doctors' phones, online drug trafficking using social media, and identity fraud. This investigation is a combination of old school investigative work and 21st century policing, using mapping, data analytics, and technology exploitation. This is, as the DA mentioned, the equivalent of stealing a prescription pad from a doctor's office 10, 15, 20 years ago. Only now, they're stealing it through technology, and they're using an e-prescription and an app, as mentioned by the DA, Dr. First. We shut down a criminal organization that was using tens of thousands of fraudulent e-prescriptions to get hundreds of thousands of pills and oxycodone doses and promethazine and codeine, or purple drank as it's known on the street, sold on social media and right here on our city streets. As a law enforcement agency, the DEA will continue to actively investigate the most significant drug traffickers and drug trafficking organizations, but also as a regulatory agency, we will work collaboratively with our pharmaceutical manufacturers, dispensaries, and distributors to ensure compliance. Our doctors and our pharmacists are our first line of defense, and it's our doctors and pharmacists that I want to thank for alerting us for the diversion of pharmaceutical-grade prescription drugs. I want to thank and congratulate our partners who joined us in this investigation, historic, groundbreaking investigation, but I also want to thank them for joining us in our fight to save lives. Thank you. I'll turn it over to DA Donnelly. Thank you.
Any questions?
So tens of thousands of prescriptions, how many doctors do you think he's cloned the information from?
I don't think we can put an exact number on that, but this was going on for a year, and every 4 weeks we know there was a new doctor being cloned and information taken from.
And what about his associates? Do we know who they are, and has anyone else been arrested, or are they?
As I said, the gentleman who was arrested up in Great Neck, and the investigation is ongoing. I anticipate more arrests.
Can I just make sure I understand something? So the runners went from pharmacy to pharmacy. So each, and you said bots would create names and all this stuff. I just want to make sure I understand. So obviously when you're getting something like this, you need to show a license and they scan it or whatever, right? No? Okay, can you explain this?
So that's not a requirement. Some pharmacists will ask you for a license and to scan it, but many do not, because it's not required in New York State.
For oxycodone?
Correct.
And how were they, I thought there were limits on how much of these narcotics you could prescribe. Like you can only get like a 90-day supply. I thought that new laws had limited the number of these narcotics that doctors could prescribe because of the addiction crisis.
Yes, but that's why they were using multiple pharmacies. They weren't getting all these pills from one pharmacy. The runners would go to CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens, a mom and pop, and pick up the prescriptions.
I thought you had said there was a 90-day prescription in one case. I thought I had heard that. Okay.
So what tipped you off? Was there one call that was made?
Yes.
Was there like,
And I'd like to thank the pharmacist who made it. He's a pharmacist up in Great Neck, got this prescription in, and something seemed off to him. He knows all of his clients. This was a name he had never heard of, and the doctor was from Florida. That seemed odd. He actually, on his own, called the doctor's office and heard the message that said, "My e-prescribing has been compromised, don't fill any scripts." He then called law enforcement, and when the individual came to pick up the prescription, we were able to apprehend him.
and this was on what day? The timeline of this?
February of 2023.
Oh, so that's when it started.
That's when it started. That's when, right, that's exactly when we said, wait a minute, how did this happen? E-prescriptions aren't supposed to be able to be, fraudulent in someone else's name.
Can you provide that name of the pharmacist to us, or is that part of the investigation?
It's part of the investigation right now.
I saw the heads of.
For which pharmacy? I don't think you said which one in Great Neck?
No.
Oh, okay.
When the e-script, when the doctor prescribes so many, there's no stop in the e-script, like there's no...
That's one of the vulnerabilities that we found in the e-script world. So there is no red flag that goes up, even if 1,000 prescriptions go out under one doctor's name. These are the things that I'm going to call upon. I can't change the rules and the laws, but the federal, my federal partners certainly could. They need to put some stopgap measures into the e-prescribing system.
I thought there was a way to flag a pharmacy or doctor if they prescribe too many opioids.
But obviously not, because this is a...
Not when you're going through the e-prescribing system. They went around it.
Is it one federal system, or is it multiple platforms that doctors use? Is there like one national system that
So-
all doctors use?
E-prescribing is one national system, but it goes through other platforms once it leaves the doctor's e-prescribing, depending on which platform the doctor's using.
He was in Florida making prescriptions up here. I'm getting that right?
Yes.
And so, how possible is it that he might have been doing this in jurisdictions other than Nassau County? And are you in touch maybe with other law enforcement, maybe nationwide?
It is nationwide. As I said in the beginning, we definitely know he was doing this in Massachusetts, Florida, New York, Georgia, Texas, and the Carolinas.
But this would not fall under federal jurisdiction, even though it was multi-state?
If we can make a multi-state case, then yes, it would fall under federal jurisdiction. But we have, and Nassau County did the only proactive case to get to the bottom of this. But as I said, it's an ongoing investigation.
Has Devin made any statements? Has Devin made any statements with you?
No.
And you believe he is the sole person behind this scheme? I mean, obviously he's got runners, but you think he is the man responsible for hacking into the system, using bots, and all that?
Yes.
Does he have a sophisticated computer science background? Do you know if he even has a college degree?
I'm gonna say this, and don't age me. I was born in the 1960s. I was not born with one of these attached to my hand. These 21 and 22-year-olds were. They were. They are much more computer sophisticated than we give them credit for. I couldn't do it, he did.
So he's like the new age Frank Vignale from,
Yeah, from the,
legit, I mean, this is kind of like, this is what you're kind of thinking, he is the sole
I don't think that the
No.
DEA is going to give him a job, though, so.
Let's not. How would you describe the scope of the sophistication of this?
So, I mean, I would just say that,
Even though I
oh,
don't
sorry,
like
sorry.
Yeah, Frank.
Yep. So this is, I think, as the DA mentioned, this is the new age of drug trafficking. We talk about it all the time in the DEA, the shift from plant-based drugs to man-made synthetic drugs, but also with technology. What we say is if you have a cell phone in your pocket, you have a drug dealer in your pocket. Essentially, the drug dealers, drug traffickers, the criminal networks, the cartels are using social media to target their customers, right? And so they're always looking for vulnerabilities and opportunities to exploit technology. And this is another example of them exploiting technology. The drug dealers are always 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead, and we're catching up, but we're having a significant impact. As the DA mentioned, this is a national investigation with tentacles all over the United States. As she mentioned, it started here in Nassau County. If there's an opportunity to expand the investigation, we will definitely look at that. But I will tell you that the 334 offices of the DEA across the world are looking at this very same investigative approach. So this is not something that is going to just happen here. It's happening everywhere.
So we're expecting other places coming forward and say, hey, this is connected, we're connected to it as well.
Right, now that we know how the system was working, we're hoping that people are going to start, agencies like the DEA and other police departments will start looking into it.
You know how he picked the doctors, like how he figured out that this cell phone
No.
is an E-Scribe?
And you threw out a lot of numbers before, but since the red flag went up in February, are we talking about millions of pills? I mean, what's the total totality of how many pills that could be prescribed over the course of?
Yeah, that would be fair to say, that it could be millions of pills, because if he was blasting out 1,800 prescriptions every 4 weeks for, I think all of these are 90 count, oxys, then yes, it could be millions of pills that went out.
Half the table is oxy and that side is ibuprofen. Why would ibuprofen be a narcotic? Is it like a level of it that becomes?
It's not that it's a narcotic. Doctors often prescribe ibuprofen with oxy. So in order to make it seem legit, they would send both prescriptions out so that it wouldn't be a flag like, why am I only getting oxy? Usually we get oxy and ibuprofen. You're welcome. One more?
How far back does this go, and do we really think that this was the guy that came up with this idea, 20-year-old from like the Orlando area?
We know it goes back to February of 2023. And yes, I think him and, maybe one of his friends came up with this idea.
Was there anywhere along this track here that things should have been noticed or stopped, whether it was, you talked about text messages to doctors when a prescription would come up in their name, or the pharmacists themselves? Is there any reason to believe that it should have been stopped by someone along the way?
The problem is the vulnerabilities that we've seen along the chain, no one was aware of. So the doctor didn't know that when his phone was blowing up with, 400 text messages, wow, I better be vigilant and see if one of them is from, the phone company or the E-Prescribing saying someone's that was part of their technology. They were the ones sending the thousands or hundreds of texts so that the doctor wouldn't see there's a change being made to your E-Prescribing.
But you mentioned that you were tipped off by this one doctor who noticed something wrong.
Pharmacist.
Pharmacist, sorry. And I know you're not working with the other states or the other counties at this moment. Would you have expected this to be brought up sooner or by more individuals, pharmacists?
As I said before, we told pharmacists E-Prescribing, the most secure thing, you don't have to worry about it.
Thanks, guys.
Is he 20 or 21?
He's 21.
Okay, this is 20.
21.
How did the doctors not know that their prescriptions were being sent?
They would find out about 3 days later.
If anybody has technical,
What?
They found out 3 days later, then the horse
Horse was
was
already out of the barn.
Oh, that they sent the prescription to Great, let's say the Florida doctor did, right? No?
if you have technical questions, we'll have some of our staff members be able to answer them off camera. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.